project. My name is Chris Nabista, Assistant Professor of Education at the University of Louisiana Monroe. I teach graduate courses in education leadership and EDD courses in curriculum and instruction program. Let me ask my guest speaker and the doctoral students in this webinar to introduce themselves briefly. Please include your name, institution, and the area of interest, and any information or interesting facts that you like to share with us.
Real quick, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Josh Kunith, and I am currently a classroom teacher in English and biology. I'm a English department chair also at my high school. I've been there for 9 years. And so my area of expertise really is grading, and but using decision making to try to explain some things in grading. And I am affiliated through California State University, Fresno, and where I continue to do research there as well.
Great. All right, who would like to jump in?
Hey, Josh, thanks so much for doing this for us. I'm Rebecca Wilson. I'm an assistant principal at Minden School in Louisiana. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on different things, especially in grading at the high school level.
Hi there. My name is Christopher Kelly. I'm actually a researcher at the university here at Louisiana. My background is more chemistry and developmental genetics, so this is a flip. But I'm really excited to hear these kind of feedback from others that have just completed the process.
I'm Jack Atherton. I'm an associate professor of criminal justice at Northwestern State in Natchitoches, probably about 100 miles from Monroe. And I'm in the middle of a second career after finishing the first one with the Justice Department.
I'm Ashley Alexander. I'm a 6th grade English teacher, and I also work at the community college, and I'm interested in studying close reading in charter schools.
Next. And please turn on your camera. We didn't see some of you. Some of you are already there. Some of you, So turn on your camera and then also use the mute and unmute button. Okay, who is next?
I'm Amy. I adjunct teach in special education in East Texas, and my dissertation area interest is in STEM.
I think I got it to work. Hey, I'm Andrew Price. I'm actually a classroom teacher as well. I'm in history, English, and then I teach Latin and philosophy and basically whatever else they toss at me. So my research interests actually are kind of similar to yours. Freire is like a really big inspiration to me. Him, namely, among the other critical theorists. I'm kind of excited about that aspect. Kind of interested to see your perspective too as an English biology split. It's not too common. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say.
Did we get all of us? Okay, then we can move forward. I guess you guys are meeting. Make sure that your audio is working. For me, sometimes there is a break and I didn't hear you guys. I think we had everyone. Who is left?
Was that everybody?
I guess pretty much. Then okay. All right, who is missing? Jessica, maybe? All right. Okay, Josh, then I have shared the PowerPoint slides and then your articles, the some pages from the doctoral dissertations. So they have read, and definitely they will be asking some questions. So maybe we can start from your presentation now.
Okay, great. And I just want to say, well, first of all, nice to meet everybody. I love some of those accents. I'm originally from Michigan, so anyway, I like hearing the accents. Feel free to interrupt me at any time with any questions, and but we'll start here. And so I've just finished had my dissertation published in February, and so the works here and the presentation is based on mostly dissertation, also an article that I have under review on a similar topic. It's just without the poverty component. But basically, a little bit of context here. I got interested in grading because it's something that I experienced, in the classroom, and a concern that I've had, and it's just something that's always been on my mind since the beginning of my doctoral program. It just kind of came that this was my topic, and I focused on throughout, and so that really helped me going through the program to always be looking for things and to look through that lens. So when I talk about grades in the study, when I did, and also when I talk about grades at my school, sometimes I get the question, actually quite a bit, why focus on grades in the first place? Again, like I said, my focus or my emphasis and maybe my area of expertise now is grading, and I use the decision making to try to understand what's going on. But quite a bit I got these questions like, well, why even focus on grades in the first place? Why does it matter when we have so many issues going on in schools? Why look at grades? They're not a problem. So what I usually start to talk about is, well, first of all, let's just remember how important grades really are, because they're pretty important. So first of all, they are the #1 tool that we have in schools to communicate student achievement, meaning student learning, to students and parents, what they have learned. And I think sometimes we forget exactly what they're supposed to mean. I mean, somewhere we can think about that, but I think we forget about that quite a bit. Also, to a large extent, schools use grades as a tool to determine who needs remediation. Schools, individual classes, could be even districts. So these tools are used it's a high leverage tool to figure out oftentimes who needs extra help, who hasn't learned things. And if the grades are not accurate, then we might have a major issue with that. And then another big use of grades is that colleges, of course, use them to determine who's going to go into college, who's going to be allowed in, and who gets scholarships. So we're talking about the future of these students in the future lives. So they're really important. I think we just need to not forget about that. And then, like to go on from there and say, well, not only is that the case, but grades actually are a problem. And this isn't a new thing. We've known about this for a long, long time. This has been documented in the literature and the research since at least 1912 by Starch and Elliott. They had a couple of famous papers now that's often referenced about the subjectivity and inaccuracy of grades. I mean, this is so long ago, over 100 years ago. 1912, when this paper first came out, the Titanic sunk. New Mexico first became a state. This is how long we've known that this is a problem. Yet, for the most part, they exist in the same way they did when that Titanic was sinking, which is almost ridiculous to think about that. I mean, so since 1991, a major grading researcher, her name is Susan Brookhart, she coined the phrase hodgepodge grading. And this is used all the time now just to talk about the fact that teachers, for the most part, in grading practices, they use, she said, a hodgepodge of achievement, which is good, but also ability, effort, and behavior, and in no specific way necessarily. And so this is the way grading generally goes. And then also, there's this major discrepancy between grading experts when they say, well, this is how we should grade based on student academic achievement versus how teachers oftentimes do grade. So there's this ongoing discrepancy. So to go past there, just to kind of clarify what the recommendations are. Grading researchers and experts are unanimous to say grades should equal student learning. That's it. Nothing else. Only student learning. And the way that we, of course, measure student learning is through assessments. Now, of course, there are many different forms of assessments, and that's a whole nother, book or talk or whatever. But that's the way that we measure learning, and that's the only thing that grades should represent. And that's kind of a hard pill to swallow sometimes when we think about the history of grades and our own, when we were in the classroom, because everybody has a history. That's the thing. Everybody has experience with grades because everybody's been to school. So that's the recommendation. That's where the discrepancy comes in. So this ongoing discrepancy for 30 years more recently, but for over 100 years really. So fairly recently, a number of researchers have looked at to try to understand, why is this continuing? Researchers keep coming out with recommendations. Well, why? Well, so one thing that has helped, I think, to illuminate the issues is a look at decision making. Researcher named Shavelson in 1973 said the basic teaching skill is decision making. So decision making, obviously, in the classroom is a big deal. A textbook by Weiland on effective secondary teaching said that teachers make interactive decisions every 2 to 6 minutes in the classroom. That's a ton of decisions going on. Things specific to grading, well, grading decision making is complex and often self-contradictory. And also that to be an effective grader means effective grading decision making. So kind of piecing this all together. So, I've taken that, and as if that isn't a big enough issue, added to the lens of poverty. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. And this is the thing that I am really, gets me really passionate, is that, well, we have this ongoing income achievement gap, of course, where we have students that come from families of lower income, score lower generally on achievement tests as compared to families from higher income. So that's that ongoing gap. And of course, we have things like the Coleman Report in 1966 that documented that, and lots of things in between. In addition to that, we have studies that have shown these major significant school level effects of poverty. Basically saying that, well, schools of high poverty, for example, which would be defined by the federal government as schools in which 75% or more of students qualify for free or reduced lunch. So in those types of schools that are high poverty, even kids who their individual families are not in poverty, they are still going to suffer the negative effects of the income achievement gap in those schools. So there's a lot of pressure in those types of schools. And high poverty schools, of course, they face many issues in addition to potentially grading issues. So that's the scope of poverty that I've looked at as well. So just to kind of clarify the whole problem, grading looks generally different. There's a discrepancy from researcher recommendations. They fail to communicate student academic achievement, and actually these issues are more common in high poverty schools. Just a couple of studies have shown that, and they're so from 2000 and 1994. There's not really many. So I've used two theoretical frameworks in these studies, one my dissertation in particular. So the first of which is critical pedagogy, which is largely based on the work of Paulo Freire, which somebody had mentioned an interest in that. And so I think it's just a great book in and of itself. But I use this as a way to look at the lens of poverty. And if you're not familiar, critical pedagogy, basically it's a philosophy and method of analyzing the role of power in classrooms, and in schools and society, to empower the marginalized and thereby work towards social justice. That's a general kind of definition. So that was my overarching kind of framework, but the second one within there, more specific to this topic of the class, is teacher grading decision making. And so I use one particular framework that comes from the work of James McMillan and his work in 2003, and I do have a slide there, so I'm just going to briefly explain that if you're follow along, this is on slide 10, and this kind of guides through the entire study. So basically, if you're looking at that, on the left-hand side of that framework, we have what he's called, and I've kind of paraphrased too, these are influences on the outside. These are things that influence teacher decision-making rationale. And the three categories are teacher knowledge, beliefs, expectations, and values. These are internal things from the teacher. There are external factors also outside of the classroom. And then there are things inside the classroom that he called classroom realities. So these are all considered influences. And then the second, what I've called domain, is decision-making rationale. This is the way that teachers are thinking through whether it's something that they are cognizant of or not. This might be something that be happening and they don't maybe realize that this is going on, but this is the rationale nonetheless. And then finally, we have the practices, result in the actual practices. Now, I've kind of taken this, and this is on slide 11, and this is in my most recent study, and I've kind of streamlined that, you might say, and I've called them three different domains, domain 1, 2, and 3, essentially the same thing. You may notice on his original framework, from slide 10 that says assessment practices. Well, in his original study, he said that this applied both to assessments and grading, went on to kind of focus more on assessment, and I took the route towards grading, basically. So the purpose of the study was to understand the effects of school poverty level on teacher grading decision-making process. And so I had one guiding research question was, well, how does school poverty level affect teacher grading decision-making process? And then 3 ancillary questions, which basically goes through each of the 3 domains. One about grading practices, how does school poverty level affect grading practices, and then influences, and then rationale. Again, please feel free to stop me if there's any questions along the way. I'll just mention that. I'm going to go kind of quickly. I left my methods a little bit vague, just to not intentionally to be vague about them, but I thought that just to go on with the topic here. But so this was a mixed method study where I used both survey and focus groups. I had 251 teachers who took the survey. This was, by the way, in one district. 17 high schools participated in this, and like I said, a single district, which I think was helped where we had similar types of pressures. It was very diverse district, I will say that, but some of the other avoid some confounding factors and variables there. So there was a 36-item questionnaire that I used, and 17 items were on grading practices, 13 were on grading influences, and conducted 4 different focus groups. There were 5 questions and semi-structured interviews, and then used one-way ANOVAs, MANOVA, Krosko-Wallace actually too. And I used a constant comparative analysis for my qualitative data analysis. So I was comparing essentially 3 different poverty groups. And if you're wondering how I define this, this is on slide 15, by the way. I've actually, I adjusted my definition of these poverty groups. It did not go by the federal government, just based on the schools that were actually what I had available in the schools. But there were 3, so I termed them high poverty, mid poverty, and low poverty. These were the comparison groups. So my results. This is starting on slide 16. And I've you might notice that they're a little bit out of order. I'm starting with research question 2 just because it kind of goes through, I found it easier to go through the different parts of the decision-making framework. So to start with the grading influences, and so these results, of course, are both from the quantitative and qualitative data that were later combined once they're individually analyzed. So I found that these influences, well, first of all, teachers showed, by the way, these were largely the same across all poverty groups. Teachers showed a high desire for student success, which is not a surprise, really. I mean, a lot of teachers became teachers to help students succeed, but we're talking about in the area of grading specifically. So this was a big influence on them in their grading, is to help kids to succeed. So that's a little bit of a slippery slope if we can really think about that in grades equaling student academic achievement. This was especially the case for students who showed high effort but low ability, that this was a greater influence. Teachers commonly talked about exceptions to objective grading where they had students with exceptional circumstances and special needs, where they would use more subjective practices. So this was an influence on their practices, on their rationale. But a major influence, which was the single objective influence, I should say, that translated into objective practices, is teachers' philosophy of teaching and learning. This was an important thing to them, but it wasn't the only thing. Administrative pressure was also an influence. And I think this one is a really interesting thing. Maybe we could talk about this a little bit towards the end. I think there's really a lot here, and this is especially controversial, I think. And this is one of the reasons why, to be honest, I really, towards the end of the process, was getting a lot of pressure myself on the study because of this topic about administrative pressure just emerged. And absenteeism as well. So as far as how high poverty schools, how poverty level affects this, and I'm kind of getting into both the results and the discussion at this point, but although they were largely the same emergent themes throughout all the poverty levels, we do have, of course, in high poverty schools, we oftentimes see teachers with a higher drive for student success because we have kids that are overcoming more obstacles. So this may be seen as a bigger influence because, well, there's more situations to have to reach out to kids to help them. Every time that reaching out happens to help them to achieve student success through grading, grades become more subjective, less objective. We'll talk about later, well, what does that even mean? Why does it matter? But I think that's worth noting here. Absenteeism, same thing, where there's more cases of absenteeism in high poverty schools as compared to mid and low poverty schools. So that puts more pressure on grading and on teachers, essentially. And likely more cases of administrative pressure. Now, the fact is, though, when admin pressure came up, for the most part, it wasn't a huge, it wasn't like administrators were coming in and just yelling at teachers and things like that. Oftentimes, it was just that teachers knew that what happens if you assign too many D's and F's, or you're going to have that conversation in the office. It was just, or they knew of somebody that this happened. Right? So it wasn't a huge confrontation usually. But this is something that was more often the case that was in the mind even. And I think a lot of times teachers didn't realize this, but of teachers in high poverty schools. So let's see, moving to grading rationale, three major things emerged. And just to mention that this was something that McMillan in his original study said they didn't really know much about grading rationale. There's really not much that's been done on that. And teachers have a really hard time explaining, why do you grade like this? Have a hard time doing that. So I was able to come up with a few themes. So first of all, something that I've termed pedagogical soundness, which basically means teachers want to, what I found, teachers want to grade in a way that aligns to strong pedagogy whenever possible. And this is really a foundation of their rationale. Whenever they can, they want to do that. And but there's a lot of factors that influence this that causes them not to be able to do that, especially in high poverty schools, such as when they need to reach out and help those kids to succeed, bumping up grades, borderline grades, missing school, maybe because an issue going on at home, whatever that might be. Maybe they don't have a place to do homework. Whenever they do that, they have to get away from that pedagogical soundness because their number one thing is to help kids. And that's what we want. But so it's kind of a misguided help maybe in a way, is because they're doing that with grades. And we assume grades mean one thing, but we're using them for something else. And this really goes hand in hand with the equity and fairness. As you can probably imagine, there are greater demands and issues regarding equity and fairness in high poverty schools. So there's more instances where teachers have to get stray from that pedagogical soundness and ensure equity is going on and fairness is going on. So again, it might not seem fair to give a kid an F if, well, they were missing a whole bunch of school because their dad just died, or because they had to take care of their little brother or sister who was sick or something like that. And teachers do use grades to try to rectify the situation because that's a tool that they have. So on slide 18, I have, this is a figure that helps to try to show that. So this triangle is something that came from my results. And so this foundation is on pedagogical soundness. And so that's what teachers, again, try to use whenever possible. We also have equity and fairness and promotion of student success, which are parts of that grading rationale. And so to the last of the major research questions about the practices themselves. So which would be the end of that, the framework, what we finished with. So in the grading practices, this is where a large amount of quantitative results actually came into play. So I did find varied grade distributions across different poverty levels. It turned out that there were more A's and fewer F's assigned, significantly more A's and significantly fewer F's assigned in low poverty schools as compared to mid and high. Did find a fairly similar amount of subjective practices that were used. Again, this comes from the survey, and across all poverty levels. All poverty levels really emphasize the use of assessments, which is a good thing. This is an objective practice, of course. But one significant finding as well was that objectivity and grading was really emphasized across all three poverty levels in higher level classes. So grades such as, classes such as honors classes, AP classes, what we call gate classes in California, gifted and talented. Whereas the regular, we call them college prep, but most of our kids are in college prep or in general at the lower level. Teachers talked about needing to use subjective practices because they needed to meet the needs of the kids, and they were kind of more free to do that. So when we look at this through the lens of high poverty schools, well, we see high poverty schools with fewer numbers of these higher level classes, fewer kids that are enrolled in this. So again, we see this, this influence of poverty in schools. And there are a couple figures just to show that too. So I'm on slide 20 right now. So slide 20 is supposed to show under ideal circumstances. So basically the only influence under ideal circumstances would be teachers' philosophy of teaching and learning. And this is again what teachers want. This is not, so what I found is teachers, they don't want to grade in a subjective way. They don't want to grade in a hodgepodge manner, but in a way we could say that they're almost forced to. Maybe that's, I don't know if that word is quite the best word to use there, but they don't want to do that. Under ideal circumstances, which never exist, but theoretically, their only rationale would be pedagogical soundness, that they want to grade in the correct way. And a lot of teachers have at least some grading prep, probably not a ton, but at least some. And then this would then result in grading practices that are objective and consistent and aligned to their philosophy of teaching and learning. But in reality, on slide 21 shows 4 different influences that I talked about here that have an impact on rationale. So philosophy of teaching and learning, that's what we want again. That leads to objective practices. And actually, just to kind of explain a little bit, we have, so the lines itself, the dotted arrows show high poverty influences, high poverty schools, and the solid arrows show low poverty. And the weight is supposed to show the extent of the influence. So as I was mentioning, there's a greater influence of absenteeism, admin pressure, and desire for student success because of the factors involved in high poverty schools. And because of that, teachers have to rely more heavily on equity and fairness, promotion of student success, which leads to grades that are more highly subjective, inconsistent, and hodgepodge in the way that they're conducted. And then the opposite goes for low poverty schools. So those are mostly the results. Before I go on to implications and some possible steps, were there any questions here so far or comments?
One question that I've been thinking of is, how do you feel about standard-based grading and standard-based report cards?
I think there's a lot of possible ways to address this problem, and I think that's one possible way. It seems like there are some issues with that. First of all, just change the entire format of report cards is something that is a fairly big undertaking, I think. Anytime that we're making any kind of changes to grades and to these traditions that not only teachers are used to, but parents and students. Because I think one of the biggest problems with grading reform is that most people don't have a problem with them. You know, and for administration to take a standard to undergo reform when nobody really sees a problem with that takes a lot of capacity building before that even gets on the agenda. So, but I think there's some good things to do with that, and it's definitely, I think, much more objective. Now, some of the things that I've seen is it takes a lot of work to educate those key audiences, which is students and parents, what these report cards actually mean. But I think that's a good thing, that a good possible way to kind of rectify the situation. But I think it takes an enormous reform to do that. And for the most part, I haven't seen a lot of things done at the high school level. Lower levels, it seems like it's more common, maybe easier to do that for some different reasons. But I think that's a good step in the right direction. Any other questions or comments before I go on to kind of some implications and possible steps? Okay, so I'll go on to the implications. I'm on slide 22 right now, if you're following along there. So this is kind of broad here just to start, but I think doubtlessly schools need to address grading reform, and there's different ways to do that. I mean, you can undertake a very big reform such as standard-based grading, which I think is a very good thing. But I think there's some other ways that we can do that might not be such a big shift, and might be a little bit easier to at least initially for teachers and parents and students and other admin to really to embrace possibly. And that's kind of the thing that I advocate for. Just because of there's many other reforms going on in schools. So one of the big things to start is that admin, teachers, students, parents need to be informed on the issue, because a lot of them are not. Again, parents, this is how they know grades. This is all they know, and so it's something that they embrace because they've gone through this. And teachers for the most part too, because actually in reality, when it comes to learning how to grade, most teachers learn how to grade by grading. That's it. I mean, a lot of teachers do not have specific teacher prep classes for grading. It could be a small part of an assessment class, or maybe not at all. So there's a lot of methods that are developed just on the fly and in the context of the classroom, which is good to a certain extent, but it gets away from that theory and the reason that we're doing that in the first place. So professional development is a big part that's needed. So this is kind of the beginning of some work I'm doing on how to implement some things in the classroom. This is in schools and in the classroom. On slide 23, 8 beginning steps to grading reform. And the ones that I have in yellow there are things that specifically are related to decision making. So I think developing a leadership team responsible to guide the way is something that really can help, because well, in the spirit of shared leadership and capacity building, and something that can come not just from top down, but can come kind of in the middle, you might say. And this really starts with things of reading the literature on this, that select group of teacher leaders and admin that can kind of take this on. But a really big part of this as well is openly addressing the staff that grading is a problem, to begin dialogue on the topic. I find that nobody wants to talk about grading, that it's almost like a four-letter word. Teachers don't want to talk to it because it's a private practice almost. It's like, well, this is my own thing and I just don't want to share that. And that's a dangerous thing, I think, because, well, first of all, we should know, everybody should know how grades are made, and it shouldn't be a secret to other teachers, let alone to parents and to students. It should be transparent. And then admin oftentimes doesn't want to talk about this because teachers get, well, oftentimes I hear teachers, it's a right of teachers to grade how they want to grade. In fact, this came up a number of times in focus groups. So it's a hard thing, I think, for admin to take on as far as reform, again, because there's not pressure against it when we have so many things that are going on and schools that need reform. To take on something like this where it's not on the agenda, that it's a tough thing to do. But it takes somebody bold to do that, and it's the right thing to do, and there are major issues of equity involved as well. Because when it comes to grading, if those, because I kind of jumped over this point before, as far as poverty goes, if the biggest issue with subjective grades in high poverty schools is that most often those grades are inflated. And if those grades are inflated, kids are going to be passed on there. So if we're not seeing those D's or F's, and because teachers are pulling for them and they want them to be successful, then they're not getting those skills. They're being passed on, and eventually, they're out in, so they graduate, maybe not, but if they do, great, but they're in society, and those basic skills haven't been addressed because teachers individually, we're trying to address in the classroom, but it was actually creating a bigger problem. And so we could look at this as a societal problem, actually, on a huge scale, from just these individual decisions on how to help kids. And again, I think that gets to a bigger issue that, well, we need to think of some bigger things systemically on how to address this, and not just leave it up to individual teachers to feel like they have to address it in that way. So to get back here, though, on steps to grading reform, we need to clarify the roles of teachers in the classroom. So a lot of research talks about that teachers cannot play the role of the judge and the advocate at the same time. And that's what teachers often try to do in grading. They want to judge and be objective, but they also want to help kids by being their advocate. You cannot do the same thing in grading. When it comes to grading, teachers should only play the role of the judge. But it's difficult to do that when you might see other teachers doing this differently, and kids and parents, they expect a certain thing or whatever that is. So roles really need to be clarified. And this does need to be something that is addressed school-wide, and admin has to play a part in this. So in this step 4, guiding purposeful work aligned with the curriculum, well, I think grading reform is so high leverage that, well, first of all, if we are ensuring all grades are only objective based on assessments, then a lot of times teachers will say, well, why should kids do the work then? If all of the grades only come from assessments, why should they do the work? Well, if all of our work is purposefully aligned to the skills that are needed, and kids understand that I need to do that practice, I need to do that work to be able to show that to learn and to show that I've learned, then that's very powerful. It's more intrinsic versus extrinsic. Grades, after all, should not be a classroom currency, but they are oftentimes. Targeted professional development, of course, is a big part. And I'll just kind of go through these quickly here. To facilitate dialogue is a huge thing. Establishing grading norms so how to do this school-wide. This is very powerful if it can be done school-wide, because again, when it's figured out individually, and these individual decisions made classroom by classroom, we have some big problems, and they need to be communicated with students and parents. So I don't want to take up the entire time, just me talking. Questions or comments about any of this?
I've got a couple, I guess, a left field question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, systemic poverty plays a hand in how teachers feel that they need to, like you said, play the advocate and the judge at the same time.
Right.
So you say that grading reform and addressing that is high leverage. Do you think social programs or projects that are either external to the school or that are sourced outside of the school, do you think that would play a hand in teacher grading behavior and decision making?
I think that's a great question. I think ultimately, if we want to think big picture, that would relieve some of that pressure right off of the teachers, but they need to be informed. And if we really want this to be kind of a cohesive issue, if we talk about this not just as a grading issue maybe, but a poverty issue, then that grading would just be a piece of that. And I think, again, the issue is that it's not talked about just outside of the individual classroom, let alone outside of the school. So as part of a master kind of a plan, a way of targeting poverty at individual schools or maybe even districts, I think so. If teachers were, number one, willing to open up about grading, but put in that conversation as well to see where they fit into the puzzle and not feeling like they have to, so they could play the role of the judge and not having to play the role of the advocate, or to know that that other people are doing that as well. So yeah, I think that would be great. That would be an awesome thing. I wonder how feasible that is, to be honest.
This is Jack. I got a couple of questions that have come up. The one I submitted, and first of all, I am a Free RA fan. I think we are well served by understanding his impact and influence. But who serves to benefit and who is hurt by honest grading?
That's a great. I think our great. Sorry, I'm getting an echo here. This is how I don't even think we realize through our entire country. I don't think we really realize how subjective grading really is. If we were to make grading reform, if we were to undergo grading reform on a large scale, and this is part of those possible dangers when we are disrupting the status quo, then we're talking about significant changes. Again, talking about, well, what grades are used for? Well, if we look at what colleges are looking at right now. Now, we know that colleges don't only look at high school GPA, of course, but they do. They still do. And so I think there's just so many things. So I guess off the top of my head, ultimately, if it's not something that's addressed school-wide, and let's just say teachers decide tomorrow to grade only objectively in high poverty schools, well, we know right away there's going to be a whole lot of kids that are failing, like right away. So it is something that has to be taken on with a significant number of interventions. And so for example, some types of red flags as soon as kids get to a certain level. But the beauty of this is when we are addressing kids with low grades, if grades are truly accurate, then we're really addressing the learning. We're not just having kids turn in homework that, what does it really mean? Are kids really learning from homework? That's another question, I guess, a big question. There's practice and there's some things that are important in that, but I think too often that it's just about the inflation and the easy things to kind of fix. But again, getting back to your question there, if it's not something that is built in school-wide, then it's going to fall flat on its face. And in the near term, yeah, kids are going to suffer actually if it's not something that is done school-wide. In the long term, though, as far as kids and society really as a whole, I'd say would benefit. But it's a pendulum shift. It's a huge shift because this has been going on for so long. I mean, the number of implications involved in this and changing grades to be purely objective, I think are hard to even conceive, and all the areas that all the things that it affects. So I can see some of both, and for teachers too. It's hard to get over the practices that we have and the behaviors and stuff like that I've been doing for so long. But I just kind of see some of both. But in the long term, it would be in the best interest of everybody, and it is a big reform to take on. But that's a great question.
Another variable that I don't see discussed disappointingly enough, and I understand we are in Louisiana, where the only union that is recognized is the Union of Holy Matrimony. But what role does collective bargaining and unions play, and how would they feel about grade reform?
Yeah, that's right. You know, that's a great point too, because again, teachers oftentimes feel like whether or not it's in a contract or not, it's another story, but that grading's a right to grade, you know, how I want, and that's me as academic freedom. And so that would play a role for sure. So that's always rough when it's one of those obstacles to overcome when we know it's for the best interest of kids. But I think that's another good point that would have to be thought of, you know. But the more that, regardless, the more that all sides are informed on this, on how big of an issue it is, and the more that it would, or the sooner it would get on the public agenda, get enough public pressure from, let's say, parents, for example, or let alone politically, if this is something that is brought to the agenda being an issue about equity and equality, then I bet a lot of people would be more willing to talk about this, because you don't want to be on the wrong side of equity. Any other questions, or see a text here? Oh, I just had a comment. It looks like it flashed. I lost it.
Maybe can you, I don't know where that comment come from. Could you read it loud, please?
Yes, I'll read it. It's from Rebecca.
Okay, Rebecca, please.
Hi, I served as a dual enrollment in English 101 and 102 teacher at Louisiana Tech. One of the greatest practices that I picked up was grading collaborations, where the professors and the teachers would all get together. We would grade the exact same essays and then discuss the scores that we each gave. It was very eye-opening for me to see the various ways that we were grading papers, and it really helped me to see the value of using rubrics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We sometimes called norming and norming sessions, and I think that's a great thing to do, to kind of fine-tune your instrument and to know, what we're looking for. And the use of rubrics is a great thing, especially for English, because we know, I mean, traditionally, to be honest, and as an English teacher, English is known to be one of the most subjective subjects. Doesn't have to be, but it's kind of by nature, and rubrics really help with that. So I think that's a big piece for each individual, let's say, assessment or assignment. And then, but that's a great thing, doubtlessly. But once we get to that step, and that's, a good first step to do, depending where schools and teachers are at, to be thinking about that. And then the next step I say is, we'll think about is, how does this go together in that overall grade, that what we show, at least, quarterly, how well they're learning, how much they're learning, how well they're achieving into that. But I'd say that's a good first step for sure, to have those conversations, because if you don't have those conversations at all, then you're sure not going down the road of big grading reform, which not many people want to talk about at all. So I think that's a great first step. So I guess I'm wondering, being from California, and we have a big mix of types of students that we have. I happen to be in Central California, in the Central Valley, but as far as Louisiana goes, I wonder how does poverty and school poverty level, how does that factor in possibly into any type of teacher decision making, whether it's grading or anything? Is any thoughts on that?
mean, from like a teacher perspective, the demographics are pretty obvious at a lot of the schools that we have here. The school that I teach at, it varies anywhere from between about 91 to 96% white, but about 70% qualify for free and reduced lunch.
Okay.
And I think there's been a lot of pressure over the past several years for us to kind of do away with the idea of social promotion. A lot of these students that aren't college bound, students that are going straight into vocational tracks, whatnot, the idea of what you kind of bring up, like subtle grade manipulation, like looking and saying, well, can we get you to a passing level? Can we get you to a functional level here? I think in a lot of ways that has absorbed some of the pressure of social promotion, that it's not so much passing students that aren't hitting benchmarks, it's altering the way that they're measured themselves, keep the students from not hitting those benchmarks, which, you know, it's kind of cool that you tie that into critical pedagogy, because that in and of itself is a question of distributive justice. Like, how are you sending these students when you commodify education? What kind of goods, what kind of bargaining power do they have if you grade them objectively and for whatever external factors they aren't able to hit those benchmarks, or if they're, you know, subjective. So I think it's kind of absorbed a lot of that. I don't know if that's true for all schools, but I know at ours especially, you know, that's been a contextual factor.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Rebecca, your experience as an admin?
I don't know.
Rebecca, I was asking you, your experience may be different, right, from Andrew's? I guess the problem is you have mic muted yourself.
No,
Okay.
I can hear you. I was trying to process what Andrew was saying in regards to in school. I kind of got off track when he was just giving the demographics of his school. And I was actually trying to remember where he serves at. And so I got a little lost there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm in West Monroe at a rural school. It's still in Ouachita Parish, but we're, you know, kind of out in the boonies, so to speak, in the southwestern part of the parish.
And you said it was 70%. But what? Could you give me the statistics again?
Well, when we're looking at it, we have the free and reduced lunch eligible, but we have some other funding programs that we look at. So whenever we're running those numbers, I think it's somewhere about 35 to 40% of our students qualify for free lunch programs, and then we stack the reduced lunch programs and other types of reduced care, medical programs, stuff like that on top of that. So when we use that figure, these are students that qualify for like a diversity of services, especially students that come from multi-parent households. The number that we should have is around 70% qualify for some type of service. It's usually around 35 to 45% are in the free and reduced lunch program.
And I felt like Andrew hit the nail on the head when he talked about not so much social promotion, but instead helping edge these kids along. You know, there's so much pressure from the district. I know at my school, at least, for graduation in Louisiana, now doing the Jumpstart pathway as well as our college pathway. There's a lot of push for getting these kids out the door. They like to throw around, you know, college and career ready, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are college or career ready when they walk across that stage.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And something that just came to my mind when you mentioned that, Rebecca, is I don't know about summer school there, but we rely very heavily on summer school for remediation, for D's and F's, to be what we call A through G ready for a four-year university, but also for graduation. And if we want to talk during the regular school year about grades being subjective and inaccurate, we don't even want to start to talk about summer school, because, I mean, this is like an unspoken truth. It's something we just kind of wink, nod, and, you know, okay, we just want to, if they're in summer school, and I'm not just saying where I teach, but just everywhere that I know around California, is if they're in summer school, they should be passing with at least a C. What does that really mean? Especially when you have schools, high poverty schools, where you might have 50 to 70% of your kids who are service in summer school. I mean, to really be thinking about what that means, what they're learning, what they're not learning. is scary, I think. And these are things where we want to see those numbers, I think, and it's just something that people don't want to talk about. And eventually, I mean, we need to, but don't want to.
And I think something else is, as an administrator, I don't want to take away power from my teachers. I want them to feel like they have the authority and they have the power in that classroom. Grading is a touchy subject. I had a teacher in my office today with some students that I don't understand why they have the scores they have if they're doing nothing, as he tells me they do nothing. Then the grade should reflect that. And so there's an interesting line there, I feel like, with allowing teachers to have the power, but also encouraging them to do the right thing.
Yeah, great point.
So something that I was just thinking about is, you know, I'm mostly in higher ed, but I've had this discussion a couple of times with some of my colleagues, because we do a summer bridge program for science, is that just courts in general have been really reserved, especially in Louisiana, about stepping in and discussing any of these subjective kind of grading decisions. And I think also that there's a huge aptitude for principals, which is probably a good thing, defending their teachers. Maybe they do something different in private, but to the public face of parents and things, defending them at all costs. So I was just thinking how there isn't really any case law to even support such a revision. And the question that I was wondering was, when you were talking about high poverty schools and things, when you were picking specifically on grades being an assessment of student learning itself, do you have a feel for the higher the poverty level, the more subjectiveness in some of these things to try to push them along? Or is it converse, or is it just kind of a universal trait? I'm thinking like in some of the schools that I serve as an advisor for science Olympiad and things, you know, I see some of their teachers saying, oh, well, they participated in science fair, so that's this grade, and they participated in this. It's not really a student learning so much as just they showed up. They were behaviorally appropriate. And then, you know, I one junior high here in the parish, you know, they have a lot of participation values. I didn't know if it was something that you perceived as universal or skewed based on poverty.
Yeah, I have in one of the figures that I have, it happens to be on slide 21, if you have the PowerPoint. But so going back to the results, these external influences, including absenteeism, admin pressure, and student desire for success, were more pronounced, were greater in high poverty schools, greater individual cases of students of need, because teachers grade on a student by student basis when it comes to subjectivity mostly. So their philosophy of teaching and learning, this is something that's universal. This is their grading policy. But when it comes to greater subjectivity and that hodgepodge nature that Brookhart talked about since 1991, this is a student by student. So basically, that in high poverty schools, that there are a greater number of individual students and cases that fall into this exception that need extra student support. I'm sorry, teacher support through grades, which well, they need support in other ways, but oftentimes teachers address that through grades, which does in fact lead to more subjective grading practices. And in this case, you know, subjective grading practices primarily results in inflated grades. Now, so I didn't talk about that a whole ton because that wasn't my focus. And about grade inflation, there's been a little bit. In fact, the Department of Education has one report, I think it was from 1994, that did talk about this in high poverty schools. Nothing since then. But to answer your question succinctly, yes, that it does lead to more subjectivity in high poverty schools and inflated grades, essentially. So again, going to the fact that so what that results is students being passed along, that the grades do not really accurately represent their learning, and that their learning oftentimes is less than that, and those deficiencies are not being addressed, and they're being passed along and whether maybe they graduate, maybe they don't. If they do, which oftentimes they do, they're going off into the workforce, into the world, into college. So either the college has to pick up on address those skills, or they're just not going to have skills at the workplace, or they're not going to get a job, or, there's so many effects that come from that.
Guys, thank you very much. I enjoyed listening to you and learning a lot from students and our expert. We have reached to the top of the hour, and I would like to thank everyone for sparing the time and joining us today. And most importantly, I would like to sincerely thanks to Dr. Josh Kunath for his expertise and experiences. And also thanks goes to our students and the faculty for joining us and asking great questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this. This is a great conversation. I love to talk about this. I wish these dialogues could happen more often. So great meeting everybody.